Welcome to the Intelligent Business Show, a podcast from Aberdeen discussing the latest trends to keep you and your business at the top of your class. And now, here's your host, Aberdeen's CMO in residence, Matthew Grant. Hi there, listener, and welcome into the Intelligent Business Show. My name is Bennett Tyler, and this week I'm filling in for our regular host, Matt Grant, while he's away. Earlier this month, Matt had the opportunity to sit down with Rachel Happe, the president and co-founder of the Community Roundtable. The Community Roundtable uses data and research to help companies develop strategies for community success. We invited Rachel to the show so we could discuss how companies can go beyond a simple metric of engagement. Let's get started.
Hey, Rachel, welcome to the Intelligent Business Show.
Thanks for having me, Matt. It's great to be here.
Yeah, no, I'm really happy to have you on today. And I wanted to have you on specifically because of all the work you've done with community management for years now. I want to say 8 years, longer.
It'll be our 10th anniversary this year.
That's amazing. So, well, congratulations on that. And I also wanted to have you on the show because I know and I don't mean to embarrass you, but I think you're a smart person who's well-spoken. And I know that you've got a lot of great ideas about, how data and certain types of metrics and data analytics could help companies with their community management efforts. But there's not that something's rotten in Denmark, but things are far from the way they should be. And just to sum up in general, one thing that you've said is essentially companies don't understand exactly what data they need in order to manage and judge the efficacy of their efforts as far as community goes. And that, as it turns out, platform vendors aren't helping them very much. In fact, you sort of say there's a bad loop where the people don't know what they need, so they tell vendors what they need, and the vendors just give them what they need, even though it's not what they need. So to get me stop talking, get you to start talking, let's just focus in on the one sort of metric that I think is key for community management, and that is engagement. And we'll take that as a starting point and with the question, so what makes measuring engagement so challenging?
A big question, and it's actually bigger than people think it is, which is actually the crux of the problem. People use the word engagement all the time, and I have kind of a love-hate relationship with the term engagement because I don't know how to measure it. If you tell me measure engagement, well, there's actually hundreds of behaviors under the umbrella of engagement. So, what does that mean? And I think there's a quote out there somewhere, something like they say 70% of employees are disengaged.
Right.
And my question in response is, are they dead? Did they come to the office? Well, then they're engaged. Right. They're just not as engaged as you'd like them to be. So what does that mean?
True.
So for me, it's not a good question. It's not a good research question. And yet we use it all the time when we ask for data. And so when you ask that question of when you executive ask that as a data errand for your young analyst, they go off and look at all the data they have. And with the online world, the way it is, we have data for everything. There are thousands, millions, the data is immense. And so they go off and start staring at all the data. And they come back with something and they say, well, we've got such and such likes on this thing.
Right.
And you're like, what does that mean? And they're like, I don't know. You asked for engagement. I'm giving you engagement. And so you both end up frustrated because the executive who cares about time, cost, and quality has gotten this measure that is meaningless in that realm. And so there's this real translation problem between what's being asked for and what's being given and how things are being interpreted because we're using non-specific language. So the first thing you have to do is sit down and say, well, what behavior do I care about?
Right. And on that level, what you're saying is, because I know something else you've written is far too often engagement is thought of as one specific activity and therefore a switch. Either someone is engaged or not. It's like it's considered binary.
Like they're dead or not.
Right, exactly. Or they're present or absent. But a lot of times, really, all it means is, did they do X or not? Did they click like or not? Did they click this link or not? And so as you were just implying, there's behaviors are embedded in this word engagement. But I think it sounds like what you're also saying is a lot of organizations don't even think about what behaviors they would want to include under the term engagement and which ones they wouldn't. Like, for example, when most companies, if they say, I want to know if my employees are engaged, it's funny, attendance would be one measure, because certainly if people aren't showing up, that's one issue. But that's if they had 100% attendance, no one would say my company's 100% engaged.
Yeah. And so what we did because of this is we created this community engagement framework that bundles groups of behaviors by their general value.
Okay.
That they provide. And so we have 4 categories, and then there's a spectrum underneath all of those categories of different behaviors as well. But the first one is just validate behaviors. I viewed that. I liked it. I retweeted or reshared it. Like I commented, thank you. I did something to validate, to indicate that I saw and liked that piece of content, information, person, whatever.
Right.
The second stage is I shared something of my own. I shared a picture, I shared a status update, I shared a document, I shared a whatever. But it's mine, and I shared it out. The third category of engagement behaviors is dialogue, asking and answering behaviors. I asked you something, you answered. I asked something and got 10 answers back, that kind of thing. And then the fourth category is what we call exploring out loud. And these are really open-ended dialogues that don't have an exact answer. And they're really where collaboration and innovation reside. And most executives want to hop from nothing to there.
Right.
And you're like, but that requires a lot of trust. Yep. And so what we as community managers do and community leaders is build that engagement and kind of nudge people along that path until they trust the environment they're in enough to start opening up and exhibiting more complex behaviors. And so when you diagram out behaviors that way, and you have systems that support those behaviors, it's pretty easy to measure.
Right. I mean, especially
that's a big if, though.
Right. Because as you said, I mean, some of it does, at least at a certain level, we do, the way you've laid it out, it does allow for some kind of binary assessment. And just insofar as, are any of these things even happening yet? Right. And then once they're happening, then you can get a little more nuanced about it. Like, as you were saying, especially I can imagine with asking and answering or exploring these things, if these, people can start asking, do these things have legs, in a sense, kind of?
And actually, we can then also use each of those behavior categories to generate a month-over-month ROI model.
Right.
That shows whether that behavior, the incidence of that behavior is growing or broadening across your population.
So could you talk a little bit more about that, the ROI piece of that, though? Because one of the challenges, I think, especially even, it's something you certainly see when companies say, an executive, we need to build a community, let's start building a community. And they don't really think about what that's trying to accomplish, let alone how is it, particularly, just even in itself, but also in terms of business. So I think just for our listeners too, if you could talk a little bit about how you think about even ROI of community in general, and then what you do to actually connect these community behaviors to that ROI.
Yeah, so our standard ROI, we can do with any of the behavior categories, but our standard model, we deal primarily with the ask and answering behavior dynamic, because it's the highest value behavior that's easy enough to measure.
Okay.
Once you get into exploring, it's a little harder to systematically measure that.
Okay.
For a variety of reasons, and we won't go into them. But asking and answering is the one we can at least get a shot at measuring.
Okay.
And what's interesting is the value of community is that you're changing the behavior and the culture of the population so that they are removing the bottleneck from the equation. Like they're helping and supporting and getting answers from each other and asking each other questions. It's self-generated support.
Okay.
But because it's emergent and because it's new behavior, typically if you've added a new community, that behavior change takes a while, and it starts with one person.
Right.
And so it's a compounding loop. In networks, there are inflection points where you get, I think there's an inflection point at 3%, where if you get 3% of a population exhibiting a behavior, you'll rapidly get the next tranche of people to kind of take up that behavior. If you get the right 3%. And then I think there's an inflection point somewhere in the teens, and then one in the kind of 30% range as well.
Wow.
And so in a really good community, you can look at value month over month and see that compounding curve and then project out the inflection point.
So
if you're doing community well. If you're not doing community well and the only engagement you get is when you're pushing content out, you get something more like a sine curve, and it never gets to an inflection point.
Right.
And so you're not actually getting the value of the investment.
Right. So, but do companies, when they're setting up these, I mean, when I hear ROI, of course, I imagine a kind of monetary value that's applied to it. So you must go, so on some level, if you got to asking and answering and this is really taking off, then, and it depends on whether this is an external facing community or an internal community, I imagine, but there are some very specific costs you can align that with, right?
Yeah.
Amount, number.
And actually, we now have research that really shows the value of asking and answering questions in a community versus, say, email or a transaction system or something like that, which is 1 to 57. So that's the ratio of somebody answering a question versus the number of answers accessed. Meaning I don't even have to ask a question because somebody's already answered that, and I can find it because it's in this shared space.
Oh, right. Because all the answers are there and you're not relying on some
all
internal
I have to do is look for it.
Yeah, and it's not up to an internal team to try to keep up with the FAQ or something like that.
Right.
So that's interesting. But so you get to the asking and answering because that's a very specific behavior. That's the highest value behavior, you said. I guess what I'm also hearing you say, however, is in a sense this validating kind of check marks, upvote kind of stuff, and then people posting their own stuff. That, I guess one thing I'm asking is, do you have to have that before you get to asking and answering? And does it have value?
It does have value. Not all communities take the same pathway.
Right.
Meaning, if you have a technical support community, you often get a lot of asking and answering, but there's no trust or connection or validation going on.
Right.
And so you can get a very contentious transactional type of exchange.
Right.
Some of the community managers we know in those situations actually have to backtrack to really prompt the validation and the sharing, because they want people to actually share leading information, not just information when they're prompted, for example.
Right.
And the validating, it turns out, validating is hugely important. And it's kind of like the gateway drug for the rest of engagement, because people have to feel safe and okay, meaning it's okay for me to be here and it's okay what I'm sharing, to then go out and be a little more vulnerable and trusting. So I'm not going to ask a question if I don't feel validated.
Right. Or if you feel like, and to put that in behavioral terms, I'm not going to ask a question here if I think I might get flamed, as they used to say, and for doing so, or called an idiot or something like that.
Everybody's going to run away except the people who want to argue.
Right. Wow. So, all right. So on the one hand, like the validating stuff, it does sound like that is fairly, I mean, if you're trying to see how many people are actually participating in upvotes, downvotes, with sharing, they're putting it up there. So I was just curious, though, about when we talk about measuring the asking and answering component, so obviously you could also just do that very quantitatively. How many questions are being posed? How many average answers do they get? How many people get involved in asking and answering? Because I can imagine that becomes a problem. Only a few people ever answer, kind of thing.
Breadth and depth. Yep.
Yeah, breadth and depth. Are there other things like quality responses, or I think these things must fold into each other, right? Because then if you have a validation, like, was this helpful, and you get upvotes?
What's interesting is we still haven't talked. We can measure all of that engagement, and we still can't report anything that's interesting to an executive.
Okay.
If we just leave it at that, right? Because even if I said, okay, well, we had 250,000 answers last month.
Uh-huh.
That still doesn't mean anything to somebody who is managing the P&L. So what we actually do with those behaviors is we then look at those behaviors in the context of a workflow.
Okay.
And we say, okay, if somebody is considering buying your product or service, what's the current workflow? And if they engage a marketing or sales team, how many things do they share? How many questions do they ask? Like, what does that process look like? And what's the cycle time? And how much does it cost in terms of people's time, energy? How many people are involved, et cetera?
Right.
And then we say, okay, if they do this in a community where they feel okay asking these questions and getting good responses from peers that are probably more trusted anyways, what's the impact on cycle time? And then if I don't even have to ask the question and the question is already there, what's then the networked impact of having a community? And so that's what I call our self-evident chart, which is these behaviors kind of strung out into a workflow that you can see shortening or getting more profitable, or not wasting as much, like not wasting as many people's time, because it only has to be done once, not 100 times every time somebody has a question.
Right.
So that's what then gets really meaningful to the executive.
Right.
Because you can say, I've changed the consideration time from 3 months to a month and a half, and now the leads validate themselves before they even hit a really expensive sales guy.
Right.
Or gal.
So, but actually, though, as we talk, Rachel, I'm starting to think is part of the kind of secret message that you're putting out there is that in a certain way, we shouldn't talk about engagement at all because it's just too vague, too meaningless, and not helpful.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I'm just getting started writing a book, and I'm struggling with the term engagement because it's how everyone thinks about the problem today. So it's hard to avoid the term, and yet if you don't peel back the onion, you're not going to get very far. And I like the other issue I have with engagement is, and this is the other big kind of onion to grapple with, is when we look at engagement data, the way our databases are architected, the content object and the transactional object are the primary architectural element of our analytics.
Yep.
Because everybody wants the transaction, which it sort of makes sense. And yet the transaction happens in a context.
Right.
The view of the content happens in context of something else. So really, I would re-architect databases entirely around the individual. And we see this happening a little bit on the marketing analytics or the marketing automation side.
Mm-hmm.
They still don't have the right reports because they're just trying to trigger more content.
Mm-hmm.
But they are thinking about it as like, what does the flow of this one individual look like?
Right.
And how, like, what's their individual pathway through a system? And how can I bucket and segment all the people who like want that flow, like, or who are following that pathway? And that then starts to automate that self-evident workflow for me. And say, okay, I can actually see the impact of this content. I can see the impact of this transaction and what happened next.
Right. No, I was thinking, even as you were speaking, had been thinking about this, what happens next component of it, because I mean, I just even think about that in general. What's the meaning of this moment in time? In general, depends on what happens next. You know, it could be the greatest moment on earth or the worst, depending on what happens next. Right? And so that's...
And here's my hypothesis that I was going to tell you.
Oh, yeah.
Like buyer intent.
Yeah.
Like, how do we get early warning signals of intent? We can only do that when we look at the behavior. And if I had one data point that I could view within all of those, it would be people asking questions, not even getting answers. Because once somebody, psychologically speaking, once somebody asks a question, they're taking a little bit of ownership over getting the answer.
Right. And it also, it's if we think about intent, I mean, I have a problem with the word intent only because I have a philosophical background. And when I was in graduate school, everyone was basically like, intent is a made-up thing and no one knows what it is. But in a sense, like, I'm more interested in actions, but the question becomes how you interpret them. And I'm more interested in deliberate actions than semi-passive actions. So to your point, asking a question feels like a deliberate action with a goal.
Yes.
As opposed
They're
to
pursuing something.
Right. Whereas looking at an article about, you know, the three things you should consider when buying a cloud-based supply chain management system.
Right. It's easy to trigger people.
Right. And so,
I mean, relatively easy to trigger people.
But I think what's interesting there is what you're saying, even once we get around to the kind of marketing automation side, is the very few companies, for all the focus on inbound marketing for the last 8 years or whatever, it's usually about how do I get people here to look at my content, and then what content do I give them next? Not what type of interaction can I invite them into once they've come to my content.
This is the whole community thing, right? You have to trust the social environment you're in to ask a question.
Yeah.
And so you can't solve that problem with content.
Right.
It's not a information problem, it's a relational problem.
Yeah.
Right? So you have to build the social environment whereby people are comfortable and feel safe enough to pursue questions. And the types of questions they will pursue also give you an indicator. So all of this, by looking at all of this data, we can start to measure the culture of a community or an organization or an ecosystem and how it's changing over time. Are the questions getting deeper? Are the same people asking more questions, or a bigger percentage of the population asking questions?
Yeah.
Like, that matters, right? And then if you can get into can I measure culture, you can start measuring leadership effectiveness at building that culture.
Right.
which is fascinating.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that was something I had put down in my notes here about this idea of being able to measure culture. But I think by bringing in leadership effectiveness and other things, I think what you're pointing to is, I guess there's always a feeling that people measure what they feel can be measured. And then if measuring that thing is hard to do, then it automatically becomes, I can't measure that. And then you don't even try. But it seems like a lot of what you're talking about here is really getting people to think about what it is actually that you're trying to measure. Forget about whether it's hard or not.
Yeah.
But let's say, even when it's in terms of like behaviors and things like that, no one cares about how many likes you got or dislikes. Kind of those things themselves don't matter.
At least not in isolation. They don't matter.
Right, exactly. But it's also in the sense of, you have to start looking at those things as a behavior. So on some level, if it's happening at all, you've won, or at least things are going in the right direction, but I think it's this idea of, people.
If nothing comes next.
Right.
Like if it's only that, does it matter?
Right.
And no, not really.
Right. But it does matter. Like to your point, it's almost part of this trust ladder that you're building.
Right. Yes.
You need to have this thing where people feel like there's an equitable way that things get judged. So now they feel more comfortable sharing. And then you have to add on ways for people to share that invites interaction from other people. Again, all these things start at the beginning. But I think part of I see this all the time when you ask people why they're doing things or how they're judging whether something's good or not, is they haven't gone to the work that you're talking about of the workflow. And
they don't even think about it.
Yeah.
It's the problem. Like it's not that they couldn't get there, but and it's kind of the fault of the systems. Like,
right.
Again, you can get so much data thrown in your face.
Yeah.
That my advice is don't look at the data at all. Sit back and figure out what's meaningful.
Yeah.
And then go look at your data and say, is there anything in here that's meaningful? And if not, let's think about a different way to get this data.
Right.
Because this is what matters.
Yeah, no. And I think, we're coming up on the end of our time here, and I feel like rather than prolonging things, I think that's a beautiful place to stop. No, because I think when we talk about intelligence, that's when data becomes meaningful. Intelligence but I think what people struggle with is actually figuring out, how do I know what's meaningful, or to even you put a more finer point on it, like you said, what matters.
Yeah. And that's a conversation, like it prompts a fantastic conversation with stakeholders, which is what actually matters to you. Like you tell me and I'll go figure out how to get it.
Oh, yeah. No, I think this also goes back to the classic. Even when we met at the time when social media was just taking off and things like that. And I think people would think they were successful and they'd go into this, hey, we got 1,000 shares or 2,000 or whatever on this post. And the CEO would be like, so what? Like, does that matter?
Only one might matter.
Yeah, no, precisely.
Like if it's the right one, you only need one.
So true. All right. So Rachel, thanks again for joining us here. The one thing is I was wondering, do you have the State of Community? I know your annual report, I may be missaying, is that coming out anytime soon?
So the 2018 State of Community Management is out, and you can download it at communityroundtable.com. We're just getting started on our 2019 research effort, so the report probably won't be out until May or probably late May. All
right, perfect. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and here's to another 10 years of the Community Management Roundtable.
Thank you so much for having me, Matt.
And that wraps up this week's show. I want to thank Rachel Happe for joining us on the Intelligent Business Show this week. Next week, Matt Grant will be back, and he'll be speaking with Paul Reitzer, founder and CEO of PR 2020. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you then. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Intelligent Business Show. You can find this show on iTunes and Spotify, as well as on YouTube. And be sure to follow us on Twitter at Aberdeen_show. And if you want to know what's going on in your market space, be sure to check out Aberdeen.com.